let's go. So insects and other small critters. So insects won't inherit the earth, they already own it. And those of us who are active in the garden probably have to admit that is pretty true, both good and bad, you know. But we're going to start with just some ideas about there are going to be insects in our gardens, sometimes more or less, and they are going to do some damage if you're growing vegetables, or even if you're, raising ornamentals. You will see certainly some blemishes and outright damage. So, especially for vegetable growers, we have to decide from the beginning, how much damage are we willing to tolerate? Because frankly, what you see in the grocery stores, this perfect, these perfect vegetables really come at a cost. And that's usually a lot of pesticides sprayed. Even organic pesticides are poison. They have some impact, especially if they're overused or used improperly. Or an awful lot of perfectly sound edible vegetables just gets tossed because it's not marketable. So as gardeners, we certainly can eat an awful lot of vegetables that have been damaged in some way. So is that too much? I don't know. Certainly there's good food there. I've sort of washed out the slug slime a little bit. But it's just something you need to decide, but sort of think about ahead of time. Holes like this certainly can be, cut out. These are probably slugs. These little dots here, that's stippling, which is probably some sort of a sucking insect, like a squash bug, stink bug kind of bug. But that doesn't make that food inedible at all. So it's just more or less just a cosmetic problem. One of the things you have to think about is, we have to find out what's eating our vegetables, if you will, that instead of us or in addition to us. So a lot of times the hand lens is really important because a lot of these insects are very, very small, and it's important to know what it is to try to identify it. So you can either look at what sort of control measures may be best. And a lot of times they're feeding at night, so a flashlight's a good tool. And sometimes we just have to go out there late at night and look around and see what we can see. So the University of California has a website, the Integrated Pest Management. I know I've mentioned this, others have mentioned this a number of times. It is a very useful pest website that covers pests, which includes not only insects, but diseases, fungal diseases, viral diseases, and also critters. So if we don't get to critters, that's someplace you can look up some suggestions of how to control them. So the philosophy of integrated pest management is to use the least toxic option possible, only to go to more toxic options when necessary and justified. And again, you have to decide, is it worth doing that? Or am I just, sometimes admitting defeat is the wiser thing to do. And you can just pull plants out that are too attacked by insects possibly, and, move on. We want to encourage beneficial insects and parasites of the pest insects. You want to tolerate some damage. Hand picking pest insects is always the first option. That is the least toxic. There are some traps that work on some species that works well. Organic soaps and oils are less toxic than certainly most of the chemical commercial options, but they are still poison. And one of the things we need to remember is that many herbicides and fungicides, even though we're not using them to kill insects, will kill insects. So they'll kill the beneficial insects, which often is your first line of defense. So we're going to talk quite a bit about encouraging beneficial insects. But if you go to the UC, the IPM website, and you can look, just, search UC IPM, and this will come up. There is a section for agriculture, but there's a section for home garden as well. That's the better one to go to, but most of the material, frankly, is kind of interchangeable. But this will get you focused a little better. Yes, click there. And so there's one section talks about managing pests that you can search by just simply, you can look at the vegetable or the ornamental that's being damaged, and it will give you a list of insects that are likely living on or will affect that that particular plant. But there's another option where you can go to the quick links section, then go down to plant problem diagnostic tool. And if you do that, you'll get this, I guess it's an algorithm that will kind of work you through a series of questions that will help narrow down what the likely, the likely insect is that's causing a particular type of damage. So I did it real quick. So first thing is this, well, what kind of plant is it? Well, I picked vegetables. And then it says what, and you can also, it could be berries, could be trees, shrubs, those are the options, pretty much flowers, fruit trees. Then it says, well, what type of vegetable? Once you did that, I picked cantaloupe. And then it asks, it says, well, what's affected? Is it the roots, the leaves, the stems? So I picked leaves. And then it says, well, what type of damage is being caused? And it's kind of important to know these terms. So it could be chewing, but chewing can either skeletonize, which means they just leave basically the veins of the plant in place, having taken off everything in between. Or there could be holes, obviously on the edge or in the body of the leaf, if you will. Or there could be mines. There are some leaf miners that actually the larva of that's usually a fly, but it can also be a moth that will sort of burrow in between, and you can see them, but it's not like a hole. It's more of a, it's kind of leaves a pane, if you will, that you could almost see through. Or there's some sucking damage. Okay, so like those, that stippling I showed you. Or it can be just scarring, or the plants may be curled as aphids do. So you pick that. I picked holes and notches in the leaves of cantaloupe. And then I got this list. So it could be cucumber beetles, cutworms, earwigs, grasshoppers, lopers, slugs, snails, or darkling beetles. I had never heard of darkling beetles, so I picked those. And apparently they are a beetle in our area that is out mostly at night, live in holes in the ground. They'll make holes that look like this. So if you narrow it down to hopefully a reasonable number of suspects, and then you can read each of these if you have to, or maybe you've seen them out at night or during the day when you were looking, and gives you an idea of what's making those holes. But anyhow, and then they will tell you, once you identify the insect, they'll give you some information about the life cycle, the kind of damage, and solutions. And again, beginning with the least toxic. So a very, very useful tool. And I would definitely encourage you to, one of these cloudy days, just go in there and click around and play a bit and see what's there. Lots of information. Okay, anybody have any questions? And again, put questions into chat and we'll stop and we can open up if we need to talk. No questions. Okay, moving on. So it is really important to look before you squish, because there are beneficial insects out there. And if you kill one of them, you've probably eliminated them from killing hundreds of, if not thousands of pest insects. I mean, a single ladybug, lady beetle, excuse me, will eat, thousands and thousands of insects in a lifetime. So, and some of them look pretty similar. So here's the brown marmorated stink bug, which is an invasive species and pretty much a big deal these days. But the spine soldier bug, they're both bugs, but this is a predator. Bugs are characterized by sucking mouth parts. So they may suck the juices of our plants, or they may suck the juices of other bugs, like this guy. And then they pretty much always have a hard shell over their wings, and then they have this pretty characteristic triangular piece. So that is one way to identify a bug, which actually is an entomology, an insect term that it has some meaning. It's so we often call bugs such as sow bugs are not bugs at all. They're not even insects. So anyhow, so important to be able to identify them. Take a look. You can use the IPM often, has pretty good pictures to make sure that what you think is eating your plants really is. Okay, why are we? Oh, there we go. Okay. Here's another example. This is a lady beetle. It's not a bug, it's a beetle. There are many different species, but we all kind of recognize some pattern of spots and the kind of oval shape. But here's another beetle that also has spots. Is that another type of lady beetle? That's actually a cucumber beetle, which is harmful. They do eat holes in leaves, but more seriously, they are vectors. They transmit disease, a number of different diseases. So we definitely want to try to control those. So here's a beneficial insect that eats soft-bodied pests like aphids. Here's something that looks somewhat similar, but is a pest itself. So again, important to know and be able to identify the difference. Okay, so beneficials, and one of the big beneficials are pollinators. Here's honeybees, we know about these. I'm only going to talk about the insect pollinators, but there's others, as you know, hummingbirds. And in fact, and then we also have native bees like this bumblebee here, and they tend to be much better pollinators than the honeybee, which is an import from Europe. And tends to carry pollen on its legs very neatly here. And these guys just go into the flower and roll around and get out and go to another flower and roll around. So they tend to be much better pollinators. There are 1,600 species of native bees in California identified. So, and we don't have 1,600 in our area, but there are a number, and a lot of times we just overlook them. Some of them don't even look like bees. We would think they were a fly or something. But they are bees, and they do really yeoman's work as pollinators. So the orchard mason bee is pretty well known, and a very well known as a strong pollinator. And my cat is going to join the party here. And they live in. Naturally, they lived in cracks, or would lay their eggs, in cracks in the in trees. Generally, you can make orchard mason bee or mason bee dwellings with tubes like this and attract some that way and give them a chance to propagate. They lay their eggs in these tubes, and they'll lay an egg. They'll stuff it with usually chewed up plant pieces, Cleo, and then they'll lay another egg and put another plug in like that and work all the way out. So that's about a third of the native bees live in that fashion in some ways, and there's only one that actually is a social bee like honeybees, and that's the I just wait a minute. And I just mentioned it, bumblebees. But they live in the ground, and about 2/3 of all the native bees live in the ground. So here's a bumblebee nest, smaller than a honeybee nest, but they do live in the ground. And then here's a picture of digger bees that was taken at the dig ahead. So there's these, and most native bees are solitary. But for the type that live in the ground, it's certainly helpful to take some mulch, leave some areas that are not covered with mulch because they really can't get through the mulch. And then and some muddy spots as well is helpful to both them and some of the bees that tend to, would live in the tube nests, if you will. So anyhow, we want to do what we can to be able to support the native pollinators. And here's some other good guys. So there are other pollinators, of course, but as I said, there's hummingbirds, there's also moths and butterflies that we want to encourage. And a lot of that having a water source, and in a little bit I'll talk about having lots of flowers around, which is good for them, but also for a lot of the other predatory or beneficial insects. So this is actually the larva of a lady beetle. And this is a pupa. This is, like, you're probably familiar with caterpillars as larvae. So insects, as well as I know, are broken into two categories in terms of the early stages. One would be larvae. They're very, very different from the adults. So this is obviously very different from a lady beetle, but will turn into one once it goes through this stage. But then grubs are another type of larva, and caterpillars are another type of larva. Again, very, very different from adults, and they go through what's considered complete metamorphosis, a big change. So here's another larva, and this is, geez, my mind today. This is the larva of a, anybody remembers this, please put it. Well, we have them here. There's the adult, and I'm blanking on it. I am sorry. Anyhow, I'll think of it probably, but that's what the larva looks like. That's definitely a good guy. Again, they eat soft-bodied insects.
Lacewing.
Lacewing, thank you very much, Chase. And this is the adult. And they also eat soft-bodied insects, but the larva often, is true for lacewings and true for lady beetles. The larvae are actually much more voracious predators than the adults. I mean, they're teenagers, so they're definitely always hitting the refrigerator. So yeah, lacewings, beautiful, beautiful little insect, but also very good predators. This is the syrphid fly. This is the larva, so could be easily missed. The fly does not predate on other insects. They eat pollen and nectar, but the larva does, and they're predators. Pretty nondescript looking little guy, but they are predators on soft-bodied insects such as aphids. So here's a few others. There's soldier beetles, assassin bugs, different types of assassin bugs. There's spined assassin bugs, leafhopper assassin bugs. All the egg clusters look something like this. So barrel-shaped usually. And then here's a nymph. So this is the other type of, if you will, preliminary stage. You can see they look a lot more like an adult, still different, but they look much more like an adult. They undergo partial metamorphosis. So they'll have to molt a number of times, depending on the species, until they turn into an adult, at which point they'll stop growing. But so they don't change as much, obviously. They don't go into a cocoon or a chrysalis. but they're not adults obviously yet. So more similar, but they still have to go through some changes. So that's called partial metamorphosis. But again, it's important to know what these guys are, because they're going to grow into these guys. And they're obviously, this bug is obviously predating whatever that is down there. So beneficials that we want to be able to encourage. Damsel bugs, minute pirate bugs, and these are all in our area. We may not see them regularly. If we look, we might, but they're there. And the big-eyed bug, this guy is really small, but also a pretty, very important predator. Parasitic wasps, there are dozens of types of parasitic wasps that typically they'll lay an egg on a host species. That egg will hatch and then basically burrow its way into the host and eat them basically from the inside out, which is not a great way to go, even if you're an aphid, I think, but it's effective. So, and these parasitic wasps tend to be very small. Many of them don't sting. And again, the adults are probably eating pollen and nectar. Some, I think, are predators, but it's much more common that it's really the larva that will be the predators on other insects. This is a yellow jacket, which is a type of a wasp, and I put this in because, these guys are a drag on a picnic, but they are also very good predators. Meat bees is another name. They're not bees, they're wasps. So they're attracted to good protein sources, but that can include other insects. So they're good predators on aphids, but they're they don't really distinguish. I've seen them attack and eat honeybees too. So, but for the most part, they're going to do more good than harm. So if we can leave them, if they're not really bothering us, they're also useful in our gardens. So how do we encourage beneficials? Well, one thing, and first and foremost, is lots of flowers. And the best kind of flowers are simple flowers like the daisy-like flowers, because the pollen tends to be very exposed and right on the surface. You don't have to go deep into a flower to get the pollen on a daisy or like this yarrow over here. And a lot of the beneficial insects will, if there aren't insect prey available, they will eat the pollen and the nectar that's available in these flowers. And that's a way to get them to hang around until the aphids show up. And then hopefully they will prefer aphids and go to them. But you want to get them to stick around in your yard. And so you've got to give them some food. And another, having a water source of some sort is also important for them. So diversity, it's good to have flowers blooming in our yard year round. Some of the predatory insects are, they're active during the winter, and there may not be much prey around. So again, there are flowers for them to eat. That would be all the better. So diversity, lots of different flowers, and if we can have something growing at all times of the year, all the better. Okay, any questions, Joan?
Yes.
Okay.
There was ideas for successfully dealing with whiteflies and not hurting helpful insects.
Yeah, and I'm going to talk about, whiteflies in a bit in the pests, but at a time, and I don't know if whoever asked this question has had the same experience I have, the standard, wisdom about whiteflies is they're not really that much of a problem except in a greenhouse and, figuring it, but out in the garden, they're not that much of a problem. Now, I've had a lot of whiteflies the last 2 years. And the whiteflies, again, they're a sucking insect. They're related to aphids. they don't really do as much damage as aphids do, except they are they're vectors for disease. Cucumber mosaic virus, and that whole set of viruses, typically. They're hard to control. I mean, aphids you can control pretty easily. Whiteflies are harder. They fly. They don't hang around to get sprayed off by water. You can use, they are attracted to yellow sticky traps. And if you hang some sticky traps up by plants that seem particularly infested and then shake the plant, you will get a number of them to go to the sticky traps. But I don't know of a control that I'm willing to use. You could spray them with neem, I think, because they are a soft-bodied insect, and that may have, if you wanted to spray them with something, and that's relatively benign. It's a horticultural oil, essentially, and it will smother them. But I don't know anything that's really effective for them, and you just, to some extent we have to tolerate them. I've gone to growing like cucurbit squash and cucumbers that are virus resistant because the whiteflies were vectoring cucumber mosaic virus, and it I was losing a lot of plants that way. So that's one strategy. That's not getting rid of the plants, but how to kind of accommodate the fact that you may have them in your yard. Okay.
That's it.
That's it? Okay. All right, some of the bad guys and strategies for doing them in. So these are aphids. There are dozens of types of aphids. They tend to be pretty specific. So green cabbage aphids are not going to be on beans, but black bean aphids are going to be on beans. They're not going to be on your brassicas. They're probably the first thing I think about aphids is just paying attention enough that you realize that they're there, because once they get established, they're a lot harder than kind of control the beginning infestation. They have a generation of many of the species like less than 2 weeks, and every aphid mom will have thousands of babies. Some of the females apparently are even born pregnant in some of the species. So staying on top of them, early on is good advice. You can spray them off with a strong spray of water, and they're not very tough. Once they get sprayed onto the ground, most of them aren't going to get back up. Neem, again, is if you wanted to use a spray and thought it was, you need to go to that step, is effective on aphids. The other thing is there are a lot of ant species that actually farm aphids because they produce honeydew, and the ants will use that as a food source. So they'll actually protect them. So a lot of times the ants will be able to protect them from the predatory insects. So if you can get rid of the ants by keeping them from crawling up the stalk of a plant or a tree that the aphids may be on, or some other way of controlling the ants, then a lot of times the predatory insects can move in and at least help you reduce the aphid population. So these are green cabbage aphids, pretty common this time of year. If until we get a cold snap, that can knock them back. But if you've got brassicas, you may have green cabbage aphids already. This is scale, which is that an alien space species maybe, or what? Well, actually it's an insect. You wouldn't think of it, but the adults form these sort of covered section. And once they're an adult and they do this, they're stationary. They're not going to move. This is black scale, which is a soft-bodied scale, although it's still tough enough that it gives them some protection, and it also protects them from insecticides for the most part. So spraying them doesn't really do any good. Again, same idea. If you see them starting and can control them, you can you know, basically hand pick them off, you're in much better shape than if they get their populations established. This is San Jose scale, which is an armored scale, so a harder shell. And these small ones are the stage, this is the larva. No, excuse me, they would be, I think they're nymphs with scale, but they're called crawlers, and you can actually control them with a spray if you wanted to do that. And I think you can actually spray them off with water, but again, they will produce thousands of babies, so it's good to get on top of them quickly. Thrips are almost microscopic. I mean, they're maybe 1/8 of an inch long, and they are sucking insects, and they will do this kind of curling damage to the, oftentimes to fruit trees or other trees. But I think, as far as I know, there are thrips that probably one time or another will attack pretty much everything. Anyhow, but they're very, very small. So if you see this kind of damage, that's when you'd have to get out a hand lens and look carefully to see if they're there. And they are very hard to control. But again, the populations, as far as I know, tend, you know, initially they're going to tend to be in an area, so you could just cut that off and destroy it, and you may be able to save yourself a lot of headaches down the road. These are squash bugs. Again, true bugs, sucking body parts. These are the nymphs. That's what the eggs look like. So one of the recommendations on IPM is to look literally daily. And if you see egg masses, to squish those and hand pick the adults if you see them, or you know, the nymphs, once they get established, there can be quite a lot of them. I know people that have been pretty successful with like a battery powered vacuum cleaner, one of those little car vacuum cleaners or something, and you can literally just vacuum them up. So that's one thing to think about. They are not very susceptible to any pesticide most of us would want to use. So hand picking, you know, if you're a little squeamish about it, and they're a stink bug, so if you squish them, they do smell bad. Just get a bucket of soapy water and toss them into that, and they will drown in there. Here's a different kind of bug, harlequin bug, quite pretty, but again, another stink bug. This is the nymphs. Again, another sucking bug, and the numbers can go up. Pretty much same idea on control. This is a consperse stink bug, and this is from the IPM site specifically for this guy, but it would be pretty much for any of them. So hand picking, eliminating ground covers or weedy areas, which is where they overwinter. Some adults will overwinter, and if you do that before in the early spring before the populations build up, insecticides are generally not recommended. There are some parasites that can help with some control, but admittedly, they can be a challenge. Leaf-footed bug, you may have seen these. This is the nymphs over here, very characteristic, this kind of structure on the back legs, easy to identify them. I've seen them on both fruit trees and on tomatoes. And again, they'll cause that stippling on the fruit. So again, but they're pretty big. They'll try to hide from you, but for the most part, you can hand pick them. And that's, and you can really just put a bucket underneath a leaf they're on and shake it real hard, and a lot of them will fall in. So some may fly away, but that's, you know, if you don't want to touch them. White flies, we talked about that, related to aphids. Yes, they can damage plants, but they can also vector viruses, and that's probably the worst of it. Leaf hoppers, another sucking insect, causes kind of stippling on leaves. Probably not for the most part, they don't do enough damage that they're a huge problem, certainly cosmetically, but as far as I understand, they're not as big a problem as many of the others. Spider mites, they can, however, be a problem. Spider mites will do this webbing. They like hot, dry, dusty weather. So actually you can control them, or at least make things a little less hospitable for them, by spraying water on any plants that you see that are being attacked, if you will. They are not susceptible to most pesticides. And in fact, if you spray pesticides, you're just as likely or more likely to kill the predatory mites that can help you control them. So certainly IPM doesn't recommend spraying spider mites with any sort of insecticide. The water spray, as I said, can be effective. I found them, as far as vegetables are concerned, I found them to be worst on beans. And they'll be under the leaves. They're not always this obvious. This is, I don't know what this plant is, maybe a fruit tree or something, but they'll be under the leaves. And if you look with a hand lens, you do need to use a hand lens to see them. You can see them crawling around. The predatory mites have longer legs and they move around faster. So if you see a reasonable number of predatory mites, you may get lucky and have them control the population. But once they get out of hand, I think the best thing is just pull those plants out and destroy them. Don't put them in the compost, put them off site, put them in the brown bin, whatever. And hopefully you'll cut the population down so you don't have that problem in the future. Tomato hornworms, it's the larva of a really beautiful moth with several inch wingspan, the sphinx moth. These guys, birds will help control them. I know blue jays definitely like them. They're big enough that you can see them. Not many things eat tomatoes, so if you see your tomato leaves disappearing, and they will pretty much, a good population can strip a tomato plant seriously. So it's good to stay on top of them. And again, hand picking them is the best way to control them. But as with so many of them, it's really just the secret is really to see them early on and begin to control them rather than let the populations build up. Earwigs. Earwigs can do some damage. I don't think they do anywhere near the amount of damage that people worry about. Generally, once plants get beyond the seedling stage, earwigs aren't going to hurt them. They eat a lot of the organic matter in the soil also, or dead leaves. If you want to reduce their number, you reduce hiding places. So they're going to be during the day, they are going to be hiding under boards or rocks in cracks in the soil. You can make traps by rolling up newspapers, and then early in the morning come out and shake that into a bucket of soapy water, any that are in there. You can put shallow cans filled with oil or beer. You want them to die happy in the ground, and they will, crawl in there. So you want to leave, bury that kind of at soil level, with the top at soil level. There are baits that contain spinosad, which is a bacteria that attacks their digestive system. So Sluggo, I think, was the first ones to market it. So Sluggo Plus has spinosad in it. It's also iron phosphate, which will control slugs and earwigs, or slugs and snails. So you can, the spinosad will control other than the slugs and snails. But earwigs also eat aphids. So again, there's certainly some benefit to having some of them in the garden. And I wouldn't overreact to earwigs until you're sure they're the ones doing the damage. Much more likely that nighttime feeding is going to be slugs or snails. white cabbage butterflies. This is actually, I've heard people say cabbage moths. There is a cabbage moth. I don't think we have them here. We do have these guys. Again, they were imported from Europe, who knows when, long time ago. They're established here. And they attack brassicas exclusively, so cabbage, but all the, broccoli, cauliflower, seem to be less trouble with the eastern brassicas, such as bok choy. So that's one thing to think about if you're having trouble with them. Maybe turn to some of those for if you want to grow some of those. I don't think they're exclusively immune from them, but they seem to be less of a problem. This is what the eggs look like, largely magnified here. They're underneath the leaf, not on the top. So you'd have to look under the leaf, but little cone-shaped egg. And they're singular, they're not in bunches. And this is what the larva looks like. And they're pretty easily controlled with Bacillus thuringiensis, which is a bacteria. If you go and ask for BT in a nursery, and they'll know what you're talking about. And you can get it pre-mixed, you can get it powdered, liquid, and basically you spray it on the surface of the leaves. And when these guys eat the leaf that's been sprayed, again, it's a bacteria that attacks their digestive system, and they'll stop feeding within a few hours, I think, and then die within a couple of days. So it's a very effective control. But again, one of those things, you've got to know they're there and identify them and know what the control is. So leaf miners, I think I mentioned leaf miners earlier. So this is what at least one species looks like. This is pretty typical. These were some eggplant. This is my eggplant from last summer. This is what leaf miner damage, probably a different species, looked like in there. But as you can see, it's not a hole right through, but you can definitely see the trail. So the larva is in between the two outer layers of the leaf and eating in between them. Here's one type. A lot of them are a type of fly. And here's what the larva looks like, tiny little things. But there's also a couple of moths that whose larvae become leaf miners. They are more cosmetically a problem than anything else for the most part. You're not going to have an infestation that's bad enough that it's going to do, that the plants are going to decline. So again, it's more of a cosmetic problem. Probably you don't want to overreact. You can definitely pull leaves off where you see this and destroy those. You'll probably be pulling off the larvae as well. So you can reduce the populations that way. And a few non-insect pests. So these are sow bugs and pill bugs. They're actually two different species. They're actually crustaceans, so related to crabs. That's why you'll find them in damp areas, because they need to be damp in order to breathe. And they, like earwigs, and probably even less than earwigs. Earwigs are kind of funny. I know people that have said they are really damaging, and I've had that experience years ago, but for the most part, I don't anymore. So maybe it's, who knows what it is specific to a yard, but again, they will do some damage to seedlings sometimes, but mostly they're going to be burrowing in the soil, living in damp places and eating organic matter, and pooping and helping to decompose the organic matter. So unless you really know they're a problem, I wouldn't worry about them. But again, the spinosad can control them. And nematodes, and there are dozens of type of nematodes, but this, and some of them are actually predatory and good, but the root knot nematode lives in roots and actually can do quite a bit of damage. The roots are not anywhere near as effective, obviously, as if they're not infested. They're hard to control. There are nematicides, but not something that we would want to use for the most part in our gardens. You can solarize, and we've talked about that months and months ago, but you can look up solarizing if you're not familiar with it. That can knock the populations down. They will probably come back. The other thing is to grow resistant varieties. So there are a number of tomatoes in particular. If you see, if you buy a seedling or look at a seed packet and you see N resistant or something to that effect, and N means that it's resistant to nematodes. So those root stocks would do much better than whatever this plant is. But yeah, nematodes can be a huge problem. They can be transmitted. They usually don't move that much. In fact, you can have a 4x8 bed that's half infested with nematodes and the other half not. Although probably if you spade that up or you go from one bed that's infested to another, and there's soil clinging to your shovel or fork, you well may be transmitting nematodes to a new bed. So if you find that you have nematodes in a bed, try to isolate that bed as much as you can and don't move soil from one to the other. Okay, snails and slugs, these guys can be damaging, that's for sure. So we want to reduce hiding places. Again, boards, rocks that they can hide under during the day, or leafy areas definitely with the snails. You know, they'll get into ivy or bushes and underneath leaves, that kind of thing, to hide during the day. You can do rolled up newspaper traps or boards as traps and look under them during the day. Iron phosphate based bait, definitely you do not want to use the chemical based slug pellets or snail pellets in your edible garden area, and I wouldn't use it anywhere because it actually can be toxic to both birds and other pets and pets. So, but the iron phosphate base, such as Sluggo, and there are a number of different brands now that use that, is effective on them. The only thing you have to be aware of is it will melt, excuse me, in the water. So if it rains on it, you probably go through a couple of rains, but after that, you're going to have to reapply it, or escargot, because that brown garden snail is the same variety that's eaten in many parts of the world. So if you want to try that, go for it. Snails, same advice, although I don't know anybody who eats these, but ducks do. So if you happen to have ducks, they're a great control for slugs, and they'll dig under leaves and find them. And so anyhow, and I don't know about chickens. I've never seen chickens eat slugs, but ducks will, if you happen to have a few ducks around. Any questions, Joan?
Yes.
Yes.
Do leaf miners also create tunnels on citrus?
Yes. And in fact, the citrus leaf miner is one of the biggest, most common pets of citrus in our area, as far as I know. There are some things that are a lot more damaging to citrus, but they're very common. And again, for the most part, they're not going to do enough damage that you want to overreact and start spraying things. And the larva is within the leaf anyhow, and it's probably pretty well protected from anything. You can pull some of those leaves off if they're easily accessible and destroy them, and you may keep the populations down that way.
There's a comment. I've had success eliminating scale by improving the health of the host plant.
Oh, okay, good. And that probably goes for everything, but certainly a good comment as to scale, because it's pretty hard to control. So healthy plants tend to be able to resist pests better. It's pretty much as simple as that. So yeah, absolutely good advice.
There was a comment, escargot, ew, not with our snails. And then there was
apparently, I don't eat it either, but it's apparently the same species. The brown garden snail was brought here from, well, France, I guess, is one place, but other parts in Europe, and
And lastly, do snails eat newly set oranges?
Snails will eat citrus, I believe. And I don't know about slugs, but I've not seen them on my citrus, but snails will crawl up into citrus and eat the leaves, apparently. So yes, I guess, I don't know about the blossoms or the newly set fruit, but I don't know why not. I don't think they're very discriminatory. So yeah,
That's it.
okay. So how are we doing? Oh, a few minutes. Okay. So certainly one of the things that you need to, and I think, be aware of, are all the chemicals out there if you walk into most nurseries. And again, I would begin by consulting the integrated pest management. If you want to use, chemical pesticides and fungicides, certainly they're out there. They're legal products to use, but integrated pest management will give you a lot of steps, hopefully, that you can take and be effective before you get to that. The organic pesticides and insecticides are less toxic over a period of time. They don't last as long. That's one of the good things about them. They still will kill beneficial insects, but certainly they're a better choice than many of the chemical-based ones because they do have longevity and they will kill, anything that comes across them for the most part, for months sometimes. If you do use them, by all means, look at the label carefully and apply them, and dispose of them in accord with the label. You're not supposed, if you still have product in the can and you want to get rid of that, that really is toxic waste and really should go to the landfill. Toxic waste drop off shouldn't go into, your garbage. So, I mean, these are serious chemicals and you have to be very careful with them. And if you're Monsanto, not that Roundup is you would call it a pesticide, it's an herbicide. I think they just got hit with, it was many, many, many millions of dollars by some people who proved that Roundup caused cancer in that. So anyhow, serious stuff. Whoops. Again, yes, read the label first, by all means. Okay, any questions on that, Joan? Okay.
No.
So let's talk real quickly about vertebrate pests. So most of us live in, suburban, urban areas, so deer aren't a problem. If you live in a rural area, deer are a problem. At least as far as I know, none of the repellents will work over a very long period of time. And a fence is really the only protection for deer to keep them out of your garden. And it really needs to be 8 feet tall. A 3 or 4 foot fence, that's just the low hurdles for these guys. They go right over. I've seen deer go over an 8 foot fence, not very happily. But they even can make it over those sometimes if they're if they're really scared. But an 8 foot fence generally will keep them out. But that's about what you have to do. Raccoons, I'll talk about raccoons in a bit more, but they certainly can be a problem. We do have raccoons in a lot of suburban areas. They are a problem in gardens. They'll eat fruit. We don't have them in my neighborhood, and I'm glad, but they are cute, but they are not sweet. They are nasty tempered, and they will really do a number on a dog if they are cornered by a dog. So definitely you don't want to mess with a raccoon if you can help it. You can and let me just talk about this in general. One is you cannot poison them legally in California, any poison. You can trap them, but with any animal, if you live trap them, you are not supposed to transport them out of their natural range unless you have a permit to do so. And you are probably not going to get a permit to do so with a raccoon. You may with a gray squirrel. So that's just a standard rule. And I know I can only tell you what the rules are. It's up, you can decide to follow them or not. But the idea that you're going to trap a raccoon and then take it out to the bush somewhere is technically illegal. And certainly that you're going to put it, in somebody else's yard is certainly illegal. So all you can do once you live trap them legally is kill them. And you're supposed to kill them in a humane way. Drowning them is not. You can gas them or you can shoot them. So by my way of thinking, we have to figure out how to sort of live with some of these guys, unless you want to take those extreme steps. So raccoons, you can protect some plants with like chicken wire cages from raccoons. Some of the times we just have to put up with some of the damage that they're going to do. But those are the rules and some of the limitations on what you can do with raccoons. And that applies, by the way, to squirrels, because I'm not sure. Well, here they are. Okay. We have a couple of minutes. So in California, the most common, at least in Davis, and I think in a lot of the areas, this is an eastern fox squirrel or red squirrel. Again, they came from the East Coast. There are two types of gray squirrels. There's our western gray squirrel, and then there's an eastern gray squirrel that's established here. They're treated very differently. These guys are game animals. You can't trap them unless you have a permit. And if you did have a permit, you did trap them, then maybe they would let you transport them to a park. These guys, you can trap them, but again, you cannot move them to another area out of their natural, the natural range of that animal. So that what that means is, you could take it next door or something, but they're going to be right back. So it's not the natural range of the species, but the natural range of that particular animal. Whatever that would be. So you cannot poison any squirrels except for ground squirrels in California. So there's a couple of kinds of ground squirrels. You can control those by poisoning them. But again, with any of the poisons, one, it's a miserable way to go for a ground squirrel even. But the biggest thing is that a lot of the poisons that are used have a secondary kill. So if your pet dog or a vulture or a hawk or a coyote comes by and eats a squirrel that's been poisoned, they are likely to be poisoned too. There are some poisons that don't have a secondary kill. So if you are going to do that, I would definitely do some research and try to pick one that doesn't, because that's definitely a bad outcome. But so ground squirrels are more easily, there are fewer rules for controlling ground squirrels, but still some. But again, you're not supposed to live trap them and take them out of their natural range. For one of the things for squirrels, if you have a bird feeder, you can, this is what I use. So a hanging bird feeder. And then if you stop them with something here from crawling up and getting into the bird feeder, and we really don't want to feed squirrels. I know some people say, well, if I feed them, they're not going to eat my vegetables. No, I don't think so. It's really, they're going to invite all their friends over just because the pickings are so good. And they'll eat the squirrel food and then they'll eat their vegetables. The other thing I found with squirrels is they'll chew on exposed irrigation pipe, drip pipe. But if you give them a water source and you can just run a dripper into them, that seems to not entirely eliminate, but certainly reduces that problem. So again, there are a lot of things we can do that maybe will reduce the impact. We can live a little more harmoniously with the critters that are in our backyard. and be thankful that our yards aren't sterile. You know, we have a few things living there. And the last thing I'll mention then is rats. Or a number of type of rats in urban areas. Roof rats are probably the most common. And one of the things about rats, and you can trap them, you can poison them. There really aren't any controls on rats other than if you live trap them, you aren't supposed to take them to your neighbor's yard. And eliminating places for them to hide, such as hedges, or sometimes it's just cutting them up at the bottom to expose some of the bottom will keep them from wanting to make a home or to hide in there. So, it's 4 o'clock. Are there any questions on that, Joan?
There was one comment. Thank you for all your helpful information and pictures.
Oh, okay, good. All right, folks. Well, as I said, we'll have a happy Thanksgiving next Thursday. Happy holiday season. Not sure what we're going to do next year. Part of that's going to depend on if things have opened up and there are more workshops going on, in-person kind of workshops. But so we will see. Joan will send out an email. Jennifer will send out an email. We'll let you know sometime in January. We'll make a decision and see. But anyhow, thanks for attending these. It's nice to have people out there with good questions and good comments. So, okay. And happy gardening. I hope you get to do some over the holidays as well.
Okay. Bye, everybody.
All right. Bye, everybody.
Thanks, Mike.